The recurring handclasps as well as arm gestures were scattered throughout historical Christian art. Many of the handclasps in the historical Christian art show Christ or angels pulling others up and lifting them to higher realms.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. And we're continuing our series that we're doing on comparing the temple endowment to a Masonic ceremony. In the last few episodes, we compared the temple endowment to the Masonic ceremony and some of the similarities between both rituals, including signs and tokens and passwords, symbols such as the compass in the square, receiving a new name, wearing of an apron, phrases such as has it a name, the ritual embrace that used to be in the temple endowment, the 5 points of fellowship, being identical to an embrace in Masonry, the disclosure of covenants and penalties, something that was removed in 1990, also being a part of a Masonic ceremony, and just sort of like this general ritual style and drama. We had a look at different apologetic responses to this, and in the last episode, we specifically looked at different faithful scholars, Jeff Bradshaw, Matthew Brown, Scott Gordon, Steve Harper, Brett McDonald. And there's sort of like two different apologetic responses that people came down to. One, there's differences between both ceremonies. So Masonry is more fraternal. It's more about brotherhood and doing good in the community. Yes, you need to believe in a God, but it isn't Christ-centered. The narrative is about Hiram Abiff, a biblical character, supposedly, and is sort of more about the stonemasons at Solomon's Temple, whereas the temple endowment is more centered around this creation and fall narrative, Adam and Eve and us participating in this ritual drama, and it's all about making covenants with God for exaltation and ascending back to his presence. Now, many early Latter-day Saints, followers of Joseph Smith who received the endowment, claimed that Joseph Smith told them that Masonry was some apostate, degenerated form of an ancient endowment that is being restored. Freemasonry is basically an apostate endowment. But scholars state that it didn't go back to Solomon's Temple. They can't really find a direct line. And many scholars believe it originated in medieval times, maybe 14th, 15th century in medieval Europe. And then we didn't have our first lodges forming until maybe the 18th century or so. So then some might view that, okay, that Joseph Smith is just utilizing and presenting the endowment through Masonic rituals and he's repurposing them, but the endowment is different from the presentation. The endowment being the specific doctrine and teachings and covenants that we make. And even if Masonry does not go back anciently, it's okay because the presentation. Others take more the view that Masonry was a catalyst and certainly used in the presentation, but that the endowment and Masonry both go back anciently, and that there is connection in ancient rites and rituals and iconography in different cultures in the ancient Near East, Egyptian or early Christians, and that really it was part of Joseph restoring something ancient. And that's really what we're going to be exploring in these next few episodes. This is going to be just part one, where we're going to be looking at ancient temples, and we're also going to be looking at what we can see in iconography, art, murals, statues, and some ancient texts have some similarities between our temple endowment, specifically when it comes to some of the symbols like the compass in the square, signs and tokens and hand clasps, embraces, extended hands through a veil, and clothing and garments with marks on them as well. In subsequent episodes, we'll specifically be looking at some of the connections between the ancient Egyptian, temple rituals, priestly initiation, coronation ceremonies of monarchs, kings and queens, and also early Christian, sort of like Gnostic-leaning Christians, and their rites and prayer circles, which have some strong similarities to our endowment. So this is going to be more of a general one. Now, this is very much the critics' position and their response to people who would say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if the endowment isn't an ancient restoration because the presentation of the endowment is different from the endowment. LDS discussion says that Joseph Smith was teaching that the Masonic ceremony was the original endowment ceremony that was lost in apostasy. But we now know that the Masonic ceremony was not invented until thousands of years later. Any idea that this is an ancient ceremony is factually untrue, which means either Joseph Smith made it up or God was tricking Joseph Smith. Now, yes, Masonry did come to life in medieval times, but many of the symbols and the ritual elements, many scholars believe, come from likely Christianity because we can see evidence of it in iconography and ancient rites, or certainly at least traces and similarities. But this is the critic's position, and we're going to read what Joseph Smith had to say, but we do have those statements from early followers and early leaders who claim that it is a restoration of something ancient. I don't think we can get past that claim. Joseph Smith said in the History of the Church, this was the 4th of May, 1842, when the endowment was introduced to certain elders, including General James Adam, Hiram Smith, Neil K. Whitney, George Miller, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Willard Richard. He instructed them in the principles and order of the priesthood, attending to washings, anointings, endowments, and the communication of keys pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood, and so on to the highest order of the Melchizedek priesthood, setting forth the order pertaining to the Ancient of Days, and all those plans and principles by which anyone is enabled to secure the fullness of those blessings which have been prepared for the church of the firstborn, and come up and abide in the presence of Elohim in the eternal worlds. In this council was instituted the ancient order of things for the first time in these last days. And he says later that they are striving to emulate the action of the ancient covenant fathers and patriarchs. So, May 4th, 1842, this is 7 weeks after Joseph was initiated and advanced to Master Mason. He is presenting the endowment, washings, anointings, and endowments to some of the early elders, setting forth the ancient pattern, since really the Ancient of Days, going back to Adam and Eve and the early patriarchs, restoring ancient temple ordinances. Now, he doesn't explicitly say that it goes back to Solomon's temple, and that does seem to be the myth of Freemasonry and what some early Latter-day Saints believe, but he certainly is claiming that it went back anciently. And also we have our modern prophet, President Nelson, talking about the antiquity of our temple ceremony.
Consider the great mercy and fairness of God, who before the foundation of the world provided a way to give temple blessings to those who died without a knowledge of the gospel. These sacred temple rites are ancient. To me, that antiquity is thrilling and another evidence of their authenticity.
So I think as Latter-day Saints, we can't get past this claim that Joseph Smith made, the early Latter-day Saints, and also our current prophet, about these temple ordinances and ceremony being an ancient restoration and having some antiquity to them. I think it's very similar when it comes to the Book of Mormon. We can't just say, well, it doesn't matter, the Book of Mormon isn't historical, it could just be inspired fiction, because really the claims of the Book of Mormon is that it was delivered to Joseph Smith by an angel, that it's ancient gold plates containing a record of people who used to live in this continent. It is a problem that we can't ignore, is the claims that this claims to be a historical text. And I think it goes similarly with the temple endowment. Joseph Smith and the early Latter-day Saints and our current prophet are saying this is an ancient ceremony and restoration. Latter-day scholar Hugh Nibley says of the endowment and ancient rituals, Latter-day Saints believe that their temple ordinances are as old as the human race and represent a primordial revealed religion that has passed through alternate phases of apostasy and restoration, which have left the world littered with the scattered fragments of the original structure, some more and some less recognizable, but all badly damaged and out of proper context. The Near East in particular is littered with archaeological and living survival of practices and teachings which an observant Mormon may find suggestively familiar. Among the customs and religions of mankind, there are countless parallels, many of them instructive to what the Mormons do. So he's saying that the Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, believe that these temple ordinances go back anciently, really back to the beginning of Adam and Eve time, passed through phases of apostasy and restoration that we can see scattered fragments across different religions and cultures, particularly in the ancient Near East, which have some similarities to our own temple ordinances. Jeff Bradshaw adds similarly, Joseph Smith taught that the temple ordinances had been available in their fullness to select individuals and families since the time of Adam and Eve. In times of apostasy, the temple ordinances associated with the higher or Melchizedek priesthood were almost totally withdrawn from the earth. Intriguingly, Jewish sources allude to things pertaining to Solomon's temple that were no longer present in the Second Temple. That's interesting because Margaret Barker, who's a non-LDS temple scholar, believes that when Josiah's reforms occurred, which I think was around 630 BCE, removing a lot of the things which existed in the first temple, and she believes the Melchizedek priesthood was extant, but then those things were removed under Josiah's reforms. The revelations and translations of Joseph Smith are clear in their witness that earlier forms of such loss also occurred in Moses' day. At first, the Lord expressed his intent to make the higher ordinances of the holy priesthood available to all of Israel. But because of rebellion, the higher priesthood and its associated laws and ordinances were instead generally withheld from the people. He also goes on to say that some of this might have existed among prophets and kings in the Old Testament, and we can see some similarities to these higher ordinances in ancient Near East or Egyptian traditions or that of early Christians as well. Jeff Bradshaw says that the pyramid texts, he wrote an article comparing the Egyptian and Israelite temple rituals. So the pyramid texts, these are ancient Egyptian funerary texts dated from 2600, 2200 BC. It's the oldest large body of religious writing. And if we take all the topic headings, which were assigned to the text by Raymond Faulkner in 1969, it falls into 6 major categories. 1 is the primordial written documents in which the rites are based. 2 is purification, including anointing. 3, creation. 4, garden. 5, travel. And 6, ascension, victory, coronation, and admission to the heavenly company. And those 6 major categories or themes of the pyramid text, of their own sort of religious rites, you can see like some vague similarities to our journey in the temple endowment. We go through a washing and anointing. There is a creation and a garden, and it's very much our descent and then ascension back to the presence of God, being admitted into the presence of God, back to the heavenly company. And also acting out on a depiction of a creation and garden, scholars say was a very common common theme of ancient temples across various cultures and religions. Alonso Gaskell, in his book Sacred Symbols, says that from antiquity, certain stories have been retold as a means of teaching people about their own history and their personal relationship with God. Chief among these narratives are the creation and the fall. And this is unique to their own religion, and many religions have their own creation accounts as well and narratives. We know of a number of liturgical contexts in which the creation drama was acted out as a teaching device. Temple scholar Margaret Barker suggested that the story of the fall was commonly enacted in ancient temple rites, though it is hard to say what role the fall played in Solomon's temple. She notes the walls of both the inner and outer rooms were decorated with carved figures of cherubims and palm trees, representing the Garden of Eden. Thus, in some way, that sacred story apparently played a role in rites or rituals of that holy edifice. So interesting that it seems that the creation drama and fall was part of many ancient temples, and even in Solomon's temple in Israel, that the inner and outer walls very much depicted and symbolized the Garden of Eden. Jeff Bradshaw says, unlike the Masonic rituals that Joseph Smith would come to know, temple rites in the ancient Near East nearly always featured an explicit recital of the events of creation. So it is with the Latter-day Saint Temple endowment, which begins with the creation story. The endowment continues with an account of the fall of Adam and Eve and concludes with the story of their upward journey back to the presence of God. Very interesting that the narrative that Joseph Smith just happened to choose to be presented in the temple endowment, which he wouldn't have gotten from Masonry, is what we see in ancient temples as well. One must first understand how the layout of the Garden of Eden parallels that of Israelite temples. Each major feature of the garden, the river, the cherubim, tree of knowledge, tree of life, corresponds to a similar symbol in the Israelite temple. Moreover, the course taken by the Israelite high priest through the temple can be seen as symbolizing the journey of the fall of Adam and Eve, but in reverse. In other words, just as the route of Adam and Eve's departure from Eden led them eastward past the cherubim with the flaming swords and out of the sacred garden into the mortal world, so in ancient times the high priest would return westward from the mortal world, past the consuming fire, the cleansing water, and the woven images of cherubim on the temple veil, and finally back in the presence of God. So it's interesting the symbolism of the travel and journey of the Israelite high priest through the temple back to the Holy of Holies is pretty much the same, symbolic of the same journey of Adam and Eve. But Adam and Eve obviously were left the presence of God and left the Garden of Eden. But this is very much a ascension back in temples, back to the presence of God. This, the creation and garden being depicted in ancient temples is supported by scholars Lloyd Fitzroy Raglan. He says, when we study all the rituals of the world, we come up with the discovery that the pristine and original ritual of them all from which all others take their rise, was the dramatization of the creation of the world. This is also supported by Sigmund Mowinckel, who is a Norwegian scholar. He sums up the common cult pattern of all the earliest civilizations is the creation of the world that is being repeated. So this very idea of Joseph Smith building a temple, it is an ancient notion, but it's in the Bible. But very much this narrative of enacting out, dramatizing the creation of the world and a garden, and particularly the fall of Adam and Eve in relation to Solomon's temple, is quite an interesting thing that he chose as the narrative. With regards to the signs and the tokens and the passwords, the very ritual elements, Brigham Young said, "Let me give you a definition in brief that your endowment is to receive all those ordinances in the house of the Lord, which are necessary for you after you have departed this life, to enable you to walk back to the presence of the Father, passing the angels who stand as sentinels, being enabled to give them the key words, signs, and tokens pertaining to the holy priesthood, and gain your exaltation." So essentially saying that these signs and tokens and passwords that we receive in the temple endowment, that these are necessary and essential for us to pass the angels that stand as sentinels or guards and to enter back into the presence of God. But many are concerned that some of these signs and tokens, these symbols, seem to be very similar to what comes from a Masonic ceremony. And is Joseph just then plagiarizing modern Masonic signs and tokens and putting that in the temple endowment? But can we see any traces in the ancient world, in antiquity, or in early Christian iconography? That's what we're going to explore for the rest of this video. And there's going to be a lot of visuals. So if you can watch this, you'll definitely get more out of it. And disclaimer, I'm going to be borrowing some slides from Latter-day Saints Q&A. He did a good episode on this, Ancient Temple Rites Restored. So I'm borrowing some of his slides. Check out his episode. I'll link it in the description. And he's got a very good channel tackling evidences, but also responding to criticisms. So the first feature, praying with uplifted hands in our temple endowment, this was common in ancient times for those who were petitioning God, to do so with their hands raised high above their heads. We see an example of this in 1 Kings with Solomon, standing before the altar of the Lord with his hands towards heaven. There's other examples in the Old Testament and occasions where the early Christian fathers spoke of the Christian practice of praying with upraised hands. It's in the extra canonical text of Adam and Eve, suggesting that Adam and Eve prayed with upraised hands, and a pseudepigraphical text, the Book of Enoch, Methuselah prayed with hands stretched to heaven while standing at altar of temple, clothed in designated garments of the priesthood. Jeff Bradshaw goes on to say, with praying with uplifted hands, that the classical priestly posture of prayer with uplifted hands was known in the Old Testament, and it continued as a feature of Christian prayer in Joseph Smith's day. So this one I don't think is a really compelling element that, oh, this shows the endowment is ancient, because you can find this in the Old Testament, and also it went into Joseph's day as well. But it is something that was had anciently, non-biblical texts as well. And I think it'll be really interesting when we look at some texts from early Christians about prayer circles. Knocking 3 times on a holy door. This is an element in the temple endowment for passing through the veil. And it's a feature of Masonry, but also something found anciently in Catholic rites, Russian Orthodox, Christians, and even Egyptian rites. On Jubilee, every 25 years, the Pope performs a rite, knocking 3 times with a golden hammer on the holy door. There is a commemorative medal, and it shows people on one side of the door and the Lord on the other. The ceremony represents entry into God's temple. Matthew Brown speaks of the tradition of the holy door is found in the Russian Orthodox Church. These Christians view this door as the entrance into the Holy of Holies. And scholar Hugh Nibley, in the message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, an Egyptian endowment, says, when the Egyptian king enters the sanctuary at the temple's completion, he performs an act exactly resembling what's done at Easter in the Eastern Orthodox rites. He knocks 3 times on the door with his white mace and then enters. And of course, there is something similar to this in Masonry as well, but it's interesting that this is not just a modern Masonic element, but we see some evidence of this in some ancient rites as well. What about ritual signs and gestures? So Donald and Hay Parry say of ritual signs and temple themes that the making of ritual gestures or signs during the covenant making process is common to most ancient and many modern religions. Religious rituals or sacred actions or ceremonial movements, as some scholars refer to these rites or transitions as gestures of approach, because they are religious gestures that worshippers make as they approach God during sacred worship. The ancient temple especially included sacred gestures that enabled and empower worshippers to move from the outer gate inward to the most holy place of all, the Holy of Holies. We also see a picture here of the Buddha making a ritual sign or gesture, which might be familiar to Latter-day Saints who have been through the endowment. Alonso Gaskell says that these gestures help make contact with the gods. There's even a Christian art piece of Christ sitting upon a throne making a ritual gesture, holding the orb in a cupping shape in his left hand and holding up the right arm, signifying kingship. There's also similar ritual gestures which take place in coronation ceremonies of monarchs, which I'm going to do its own episode on. Okay, what about tokens and handclasps? This emblem has been well documented in early Christian iconography by Todd Compton and Stephen Ricks. Matthew Brown argues that Psalms 41 and 73 feasibly indicate that when the king of Israel was initiated within the precincts of the temple into the office of kingship, he passed through the veil of the Holy of Holies and symbolically entered into God's presence by taking them by the right hand. Alonso Gaskell speaks of tokens that the early Christians had what some refer to as tokens of recognition or handclasps, utilized for a number of reasons. Handclasps for covenant making or reconciliation were common in ancient cultures and religions. A solemn and ceremonial handclasp known by the Greeks as dexiosis, which means joining the right hands, commonly used when taking an oath or when receiving the mysteries. Jeff Bradshaw says in an article that the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, or mysteries just kind of mean sacred rites, endured over a period of nearly 2,000 years. So these were ancient rites preserved for over 2,000 years. That these rites were said to consist of things recited, shown, and performed. And a sacred casket contained the tokens of the god, which were used to teach initiates about the meaning of the rites. At the culmination of the process, the initiate was examined about his knowledge of these tokens. Having passed the tests of the tokens and their passwords, the initiate would have been admitted to the presence of God. So he's saying that like tokens or handclasps were very much used anciently. We can see it with early Christians. Handclasps is either tokens of recognition or for making certain covenants. And with regards to Greek Eleusinians and their sacred rites, that they would have handclasps for imparting knowledge, and then they would be examined about these tokens, having to pass tests and offer the passwords, which has some correspondences to what goes on in our temple endowment. Here's also a picture of the Mandaeans in their ritual engaging in handclasps. This is the Kushta, taken in 1956. Todd Compton says in early Christianity, the handclasp and embrace are seen as tokens of recognition. And he says it continued in early Christian ritual, both Gnostic and Orthodox. So I'm going to read through this. This comes from a blog. I think it's a Temple Endowment blog spot, but I think this is really fascinating and interesting what it has to say about early Christians and handclasps, and also a non-canonical text, which has some really strong similarities about Adam and Eve and what they had to go through to return back to God. He says, handclasps are part of the ritual motif of the secret teachings taught by Christ and the oaths and covenants made during those rites. The early Christians were charged by anti-Christians of being a mystery religion because they had secret ceremonies and borrowed elements from pagan mystery religions, which is a similar criticism that we as Latter-day Saints get about our secret ceremonies that we have in temples and that we've just taken them from the Masons, like what non-Christians were saying about the Christians and their secret rites, that they just took it from the pagans. Handclasps were seen as part of those elements borrowed by the ancient Christians, yet there are clear examples of elements in conjunction to oath and covenant making in the Bible. Christian artworks were a visual means to remind the saints of not only different stories in the Bible, but oaths or covenants they made during their sacred rites. And we're going to look at some visual pictures and murals of different stories in the Bible, but showing a handclasp, particularly between a divine being through a veil, and how they're saying that this was often done to remind the Christians of some of the oaths and promises that they made. The recurring handclasps, as well as arm gestures, were scattered throughout historical Christian art. Many of the handclasps in the historical Christian art show Christ or angels pulling others up and lifting them to higher realms. And I'm going to just flash some pictures on the screen here. This is really interesting. So this comes from a non-canonical text. It is considered pseudepigrapha, but there's accounts of the creation drama in which Adam and Eve are visited and instructed by 3 angels and a pre-incarnate Christ, who promised to one day rescue them from hell and guide them back to the former state of glory. Adam and Eve make covenants or taught different aspects of the mysteries, including anointing, garments, handclasps, prayer gestures, and the way back to heaven. And that does sound very similar to the narrative in our temple endowment. Definitely an interesting correspondence, at least. Okay, let's talk about passwords. So Alonzo Gaskell says that frequently accompanying the signs and tokens anciently were secret words or phrases. They are found in specific Catholic rites, in some rare rites associated with Judaism and certain branches of Islam. These secret words or passwords symbolize fidelity to covenants if they were kept secret. Okay, what about the symbolism of a hand being extended through the veil? The mural of the extended hand of God from the 12th century St. Clement de Tal church in Catalonia, Spain, God's hand reaching out from behind a cloud or veil, is a common symbol in the medieval period. In the intertestamental period, God's extended hand was sometimes a symbol of testing and examination. Particularly striking is the image of Isaac, which seems to depict an event that followed Abraham's attempted sacrifice. We see Isaac approaching a veil, and there's a hand extended through the cloud. We even have a hand clasp dated AD 400 depicting Jesus' ascension back to heaven, doing a hand clasp with a divine hand through a veil. The scene of Isaac's ascension is reminiscent of a Christian portrayal of Jesus' entry into heaven. There's also mutual embraces, which are very comparable to mutual embrace that occurs at the veil of the temple, depicted in art or statues. And while in Masonry this is done with a fellow Mason, this is often depicted in art or in statues as being with a divine being. There's a depiction of an ancient Egyptian ceremony. This is a drawing of the bark shrine, Karnak, 320 BCE. This was shared by Jeff Bradshaw in our video. It depicts washing ceremony, anointing, and preparing to come back into the seated presence of deity, which included a queen mother in the Egyptian world. It's interesting the number of murals and art and iconography we have depicting handclasps, and also handclasps not just for covenant making, but with divine beings, sometimes a hand through a veil, and this ritual embrace as well between divine beings. It's interesting that Joseph in the endowment seemed to be very much repurposing the hand clasp back to sort of how it was used anciently, particularly in Christianity, and as it's depicted in religious art and rituals. Okay, let's explore the symbol of the compass of the square. This symbol is in our temple endowment, temple clothing, and you would also find these tools or objects in a Masonic ceremony. Compass and the square symbol in both Masonry and in the temple endowment is also found as symbols in ancient iconography and found on Christian clothing. We have here ancient paintings of the first rulers of China holding the tools of creation, the compass and the square, and one of the earliest images of a square is a carpenter from the tomb of Rekhmir in Egypt, coming from the 18th dynasty, 1543 to 1292 BC. So we can see that these are ancient symbols that we're seeing in ancient Egypt and China. In the Bible, in the book of Proverbs, it says, during the creation, the Lord set a compass or inscribed a circle upon the face of the earth. And we have depictions and images of Christ creating the earth using a compass. We also have in Christian art depictions of Christ and his followers wearing robes or garments with a compass and square mark on them. One is the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. It's a 5th century mosaic, and it has gamma marks in the robes of the angels. Scholar Erwin R. Goodenough, I think that's his name, says in Christian art, the garment and robe were marked with signs at right angles, the gamma or square, or simply with a straight bar with prongs. The marks had some religious significance or symbolic force. Okay, and this is pretty cool, this find. There was even a cemetery found among Egyptian Christian monks I think it's dated the cemetery between like AD 200 to 800. And BYU Studies was very much involved in this archaeological excavation of ancient ruins and some of these monks. And there were found like monks with like leather belts and aprons, wearing like some sort of priestly robes with knots, and some with undergarments with rosettes in places that will sound very similar to Latter-day Saints. So this comes from the article in BYU Studies, Evidences of a Christian Population in the Egyptian Fayum, I think that's how you say it, and Genetic and Textile Studies of the Akhmim Noble Mummies. I'll link it in the description. So they say excavations from a pre-Coptic Christian cemetery in Egypt show clothing as follows. On the left is a robe that has linen strips gathered together in a knot on one of the shoulders, which may indicate that it is a priestly piece of clothing. Some of the robes worn by these Christians have the knot located on the left shoulder, while others have it on the right shoulder. What is curious about this piece of clothing is that it was decorated with rosettes over each breast and over the right knee, but not over the left knee. Then there is the hem cut over the abdomen. This feature is significant because a straight line design is sometimes depicted in artistic representations of early Christian white garments. That is very fascinating. They also state about undergarments of some monks that were dug up. They said, clothing closest to the body is not usually well preserved due to the destructive influence of fluids and chemicals remaining in the body. In this burial, however, the woolen garment next to the skin is sufficiently well preserved for us to observe that small rosettes or marks have been woven into the material in particular locations. There is one rosette over each breast, one on the right leg near the knee, but there is no corresponding rosette on the left leg. Across the lower abdomen, the material has also a hem slit about 6 inches long. Okay, that has very striking correspondences to our temple endowment and temple clothing and garments. That's very similar. And so this notion of early Christians, monks wearing and being buried in some sort of priestly robes and wearing garments with rosettes and marks is something that there's actually evidence for, not just in iconography, but also in the archaeological find in the ancient world. And there's only one really explanation for this. Either it is just a coincidence, or Joseph Smith, after he went through the Masonic Lodge, he broke into the cemetery and looked at the undergarment clothing they were wearing, or he was a prophet. Okay, you could just say a lucky coincidence, but I think this is kind of interesting. I don't want to overplay it. This idea of undergarments with sacred symbols on them definitely isn't absurd or clearly a modern invention that Joseph Smith just made up. There's ancient precedents found both in Christian art and archaeological finds. Okay, I'm going to finish today's episode, and in the next episode, we will explore the ancient Egyptian temple rituals a little bit more in depth. I'm just going to summarize today's episode and what we've explored. So absolutely, Joseph Smith claimed that these ordinances and rituals are ancient and that they were had among the ancient patriarchs. Our current prophet also says that these rituals in the temple are of ancient antiquity. Brigham Young said the endowment is to prepare us to return back to the presence of God, knowing the signs, tokens, and passwords that pass the angels. We've discussed how the creation of the world and returning back to the presence of God, and likely this dramatization of a creation in garden, is something which seemed to occur in a lot of ancient temples across different religions. And the reverse journey of Adam and Eve back to the presence of God is found in the Israelite temple in the journey of the high priest. We discussed that many of the symbols in Masonry and the endowment, such as the compass in the square, or the compass in the square in ritual clothing, or Christians wearing garments with rosettes, or priestly robes, ritual signs and gestures and making oaths, secret rites with passwords, handclasps with the deity, a hand extending through a veil, 3 knocks on the holy door, are things that we can see anciently in rites, iconography, or art. And that these elements, which are also in the temple endowment, aren't just modern or exclusively plagiarized from Masonry, but we can see some of this in the ancient world, and some of this, you could say, it appears, particularly when it comes to the use of handclasps, repurposing back to the ancient form. He's not using the symbols in the same way as they are used in Masonry. I know critics might say that the pushback to this is you're just trying to find sort of traces or little things from different sources and trying to find evidence or parallels. And I do think it's interesting that we can find traces in many of these symbols and ritual elements across different cultures. But in the subsequent episodes, we're going to be more specifically comparing ancient Egyptian temple endowment, priestly initiations and coronation ceremonies, and what I think is probably the strongest parallels is early Christian Gnostic leaning rituals and prayer circles to our endowment. But this episode was more of a real general opener and a taster. At least some of the symbols and aspects of the endowment ritual does seem to have some traces and connection to some things in the ancient world. And even if the temple endowment was just made up by Joseph Smith and it's not a restoration of ancient temple rites, at least I think what we've seen so far is you can't argue that there's no resemblances to anything in the ancient world, to different religions and cultures, specific rites, iconography. And I think the resemblance and correspondences will grow stronger in the upcoming episodes. Thanks so much for watching this episode. Give it a like, share it, subscribe, donate if you want. Give me all your money. See you next time. Take care. Bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.